Thanks everyone for joining us. This is our weekly Center for Healthcare Policy and Research seminar series. As you all know, some of you are here for different reasons, students, faculty, staff, but we rotate topics on policy topics and community engagement topics and clinic engaged topics. And so a close colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Richard Grant, is our esteemed speaker today. We are so lucky to have him talk about some of his work at the Kaiser Permanente Division of Research. Richard is an internist. He has an MPH from, I believe, Harvard. He has been doing diabetes research and has been a mentor of mine for many years. He's just an excellent interventionist, informaticist. I'm going to call you that, evaluation expert across the board, and has been doing some work recently in deprescribing and some work with older adults with diabetes. So we are so fortunate to have him with us. He's a primary scientist at the Kaiser Permanente Division of Research. So thank you, Richard, and take it away. I told Richard that you can enter questions in the chat. You can save them for the end, but there will be plenty of time to ask him questions. So please do save them up as he goes through his content. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney, and thanks for that embarrassing introduction. I am on my laptop, so I won't see questions, but maybe Courtney can ask anything
Yep,
that's in the
I
chat.
will.
Okay, so I would like to thank the UC Davis Center for Healthcare Policy and Research. Today, I'm going to talk about two pragmatic clinical trials in older adults with type 2 diabetes. One of them is completed and published, and the other is ongoing. And they represent two different strategies for improving safety in older adults. One is going to be about deprescribing, and one is going to be about more effective monitoring. Um, in addition to talking about the content area and the results, I'm going to try to highlight some of the pragmatic implementation challenges that I face with these two studies and sort of strategies for being able to conduct pragmatic clinical trials. So I have no conflicts to disclose. So let's just talk about hypoglycemia for a moment in older patients with type 2 diabetes. Over the past couple of decades, hospitalization trends have flipped, and where in the old days, a leading cause of hospitalization was hyperglycemia. As we've gotten better at controlling glucose levels, the leading cause of hospitalization, primary, is hypoglycemia now. So this is sort of a paradigm shift, and these are predominantly older patients. And in older patients being treated for diabetes, hypoglycemia is generally a consequence of treatment. So why does that matter? Uh, Patients with type 2 diabetes who are hospitalized with hypoglycemia have a much higher subsequent mortality rate compared to those that aren't. Hypoglycemia outside of the hospital is associated with a big increase in fall-related fractures. And in elderly patients, a hip fracture is often a precursor to a nursing home stay, and sometimes they never go home. And then it's also associated with episodes of hypoglycemia are associated with accelerated cognitive decline and a greater burden of depression. So this is a real problem, and it's an impactful problem, and it's potentially a reversible problem. It's certainly a fundable problem. So what is deprescribing? This is the first strategy we'll talk about. The U.S. Deprescribing Research Network defines it as the thoughtful and systematic process of identifying problematic medications and either reducing the dose or stopping these medications in a manner that's safe, effective, helps people maximize their wellness and goals of care. Okay, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Why do we need to keep going? Well, it's not easy. Little is known about how to best identify which medications to deprescribe, how to safely and effectively stop them, and probably most importantly for what I'm going to talk about today, how to engage patients, clinicians, and the health system in this process in a patient-centered manner. There's a lot of research on barriers to deprescribing. Here are two examples. There was a national survey of physicians asking them about deprescribing in diabetes. And key points for that, physicians have ambivalence about the relative benefits and harm. Ambivalence means they're not really sure. And they also view a potential source of conflict when talking about this with their patients. On the patient side is a nice study where they looked at facilitators and for patients understanding why the prescriber was deprescribing, the perceived expertise, and the perceived benefit. So that's all intro to the first study I'll talk about, which we titled Reducing Treatment Risk in Older Adults with Diabetes Mellitus, or retro-DM. Here, our question was, can we encourage primary care physicians and their high-risk patients to discuss diabetes medication deprescribing? So right off the bat, we're not actually ourselves as researchers, as the intervention, trying to deprescribe. We just want the conversation to happen. And our hypothesis is that some of those patients will truly benefit clinically from deprescribing. And if we have that conversation and it's an informed conversation, it's more likely to happen. So for this study, patients were 75 years or more, had type 2 diabetes, and were treated with insulin or sulfonylureas. Those are two medicines most responsible for hypoglycemia. And they had relatively good control of their glucose, indicated by hemoglobin A1C of less than 8%. This was a comparative effectiveness randomized clinical trial. This is sort of a requirement for projects that are funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. And what that means is that there's no control arm. There's two active comparison arms. And so for our study, our intervention was academic detailing for physicians, and I'll describe that. And then physicians were randomized to get academic detailing alone or to get academic detailing, and their eligible patients had a pre-visit handout. So our primary outcome was deprescribing at 6 months, which we defined as dose reduction, discontinuation, switching between high risk to lower risk medicine, or reducing the total number of therapeutic classes. We also looked at some self-reported outcomes, and we did a structured chart abstraction to look at documentation of discussion of diabetes management. Because deprescribing could potentially cause safety issues, we also looked at hospitalizations or ED visits for hyperglycemia, which could be a consequence of reducing treatment. And then we looked for patients with A1Cs greater than 8, which could be another indicator of poor glycemic control, and also whether the deprescribing was reversed in the second half of the year. So the orange slides are the ones where I'm trying to list some of the issues that we dealt with as pragmatic clinical trialists. And so this intervention I described, one of the real challenges is, how do you engage physicians? How do you get time with physicians? And the patient-doctor communication is something that happens behind closed doors. So how do you influence that without being overbearing and like trying to be in the room with them? In addition, our patients are 75 and older with diabetes, and the intervention, as you'll see, has a very significant virtual component. So how do you get older folks to engage with you virtually? And then, all RCTs have questions about level of consent. Do you consent PCPs? Do you consent patients? Do you get written consent, verbal consent? And then there's sort of new challenges for us, at least, in how to measure deprescribing and patient-doctor communication. So our intervention primarily was academic detailing. The woman who is with the headphones is Dr. Lisa Gilliam, a co-investigator. She's a diabetes endocrinologist, and she's also the KP clinical lead for diabetes. So she's a well-recognized expert that the primary care physicians we present to would know about. Academic detailing was a 30-minute virtual presentation. And what's critical is that it was conducted during usual primary care practice weekly meetings. So all primary care practices at all the medical facilities, they always have like a regular meeting. And it often is kind of like a boring business meeting where they talk about access or whatever. And so we got onto their schedule and we presented something that was of interest to them. So one of the intervention challenges is, how do you engage, and coming to where they are and fitting with their schedule is sort of the way to do it. So academic detailing talks about, she sort of emphasizes, as you get older, things change, defined deprescribing, talked about risk and benefits. And importantly, much of this presentation was case-based, which is sort of a validated way of teaching physicians because they kind of like that better. So we went through cases together and also described the study. The physicians were randomized, and those who were randomized to have their patients receive the pre-visit handout, this is what the pre-visit handout was. It was a simple PDF, front and back, We emailed it to them. We snail mailed it to them. And it's essentially academic detailing for patients. So the front page is just talking about the idea of should you even think about reducing or stopping your medicines, the benefits and the risks as you get older. It's sort of validated by guidelines that they talk about this, but it's just a shared decision. And then on the back, we tried to elicit patients' preferences and values, how they feel about their current meds, how important is them for type control versus avoiding side effects, and how comfortable they feel about making changes. And at the very bottom, it's kind of a prompt. Check this box. I'd like to discuss this with my doc next time, or I need to talk to my family first, or I don't want to talk about it. So study went well. It's published in August, so this is pretty fresh in JAMA Internal Medicine. Um, so I'll talk a little bit about the details of the study and the results, and then come back to the barriers, and then we'll move on to the other study, and then we can compare them side by side and then answer questions that you have. So we had a 36% consent rate, which is actually quite good for an older population like ours. And as I mentioned, we allocated randomly the physicians, and then their patient panels followed with them, and then the patients themselves were consented. We didn't obtain consent from physicians. We had a IRB waiver of that. That meant we didn't collect any data, like survey data from the physicians, because that would have required consent. So, a lot of pragmatic clinical trials, you make these sort of decisions, and made much more sense to not collect that data so that we didn't have to sit down with each one and have them sign a consent form. In addition, because this is a very low risk intervention that's primarily educational, we were able to get IRB approval to do verbal consent over the phone, not requiring a written consent form, which also made the study a lot easier to conduct. Okay, what happened? We won. So at 6 months, our primary outcome, 15.8% of the patients in the arm where there was the handout in addition to academic detailing had deprescribing, compared to only 9% in the arm that had academic detailing alone without the handout. This is a 7.5% adjusted difference, and that was clinically significant. In terms of clinical impact, none of the patients in the handout arm had ED-related admissions, whereas 4 did in the academic detailing, and this was statistically significant. Then we also looked 12 months later, and we found the same spread. So the difference in deprescribing was 7.9% between arms, and that was almost at 0.05. And the difference in admissions was actually, the difference was 4, but is no longer statistically significant because of the way chi-square works and the difference between having a 0 cell or not. So success. We also looked, if it wasn't successful, I probably wouldn't be presenting it. So there's a little bit of a ascertainment bias there. Anywho, we found no difference in self-reported severe hypoglycemia and other patient-reported measures. One of the issues we had is as a sort of causal pathway marker, it'd be nice to know whether the patients with the handout had more conversations with their physicians. We actually initially, when we submitted the proposal, had the idea of recording visits, and that's something that we've done in prior studies. Problem was that after COVID, so many of the visits were virtual, and we weren't able to record virtual visits because it would have required the physician to press record, which we didn't want to ask them to do. So we had to pivot, and what we ended up doing was a structured chart abstraction of every single patient in both arms, just looking for evidence of discussion of diabetes. And that might seem like a very light touch, but there's 2 important factors. One is that these patients are 75 and older. They have a lot going on besides diabetes. And what we found in our other studies is that diabetes is often like the 3rd or 4th or 6th thing, and it often doesn't get talked about at all. And the second thing is doctors don't scribe things that aren't important. So we thought that if they were really talking about diabetes, that's probably a good thing. And the documentation of that in the progress note is a reasonable surrogate marker. And in fact, we found that almost 60% of patients who had the handout were more likely to have documentation of the progress note compared to under 50% in the other arm where there's only academic detailing. We didn't identify any downsides of this. There's no more hyperglycemia admissions. Glycemic control is similar, and very few patients were undeprescribed. So one of the other issues is that because it was PCORI, we didn't have a control arm. We didn't have a randomized control arm. But I really wanted to know, because the way that the study is, the question that we answer is what's the marginal benefit of adding a patient handout to academic detailing? But what I really wanted to know is that does this whole process, particularly academic detailing, is that better than usual care? And so without a randomized arm, we had to look for sort of a cohort comparison. And what we did is, and what you'll often do in observational research is maybe have more than one comparison to see sort of how it evens out. So we identified all the PCPs in the clinical practices where we did the academic detailing who are unable to attend. So there might be some bias there, but in general, not all docs work full time. Some docs, the last patient visit overlaps with lunch. And so, people just don't make it all the time. The advantage of looking at that cohort is that it's the same facility. So any facility differences are controlled for. But then we created a second cohort, which is PCPs, Kaiser Permanente primary care physicians at geographically neighboring facilities. So the facilities are pretty similar. The patient demographics are pretty similar. And there was no bias there in terms of whether they wanted to participate or not, because they were never invited to participate in the study. And then we compared their 1 year deprescribing rates to the patients who are in our retro study, but not the patients who consented to participate, because that's a biased subset, but all the patients who are electronically eligible. So we identified patients exactly the same way from the study and then the two comparison cohorts. So these red boxes are the practices where we conducted the study, and then these green practices are sort of the neighbors that we used for the second cohort. And the PCPs are fairly similar. There tend to be more women who attended the academic detailing, but otherwise similar age, years of practice, and panel size. And what we found is that our academic detailing rate for the whole cohort was 19.1%, which was significantly higher than the rate over the year for the physicians in the same practices who didn't have academic detailing, and for the physicians in the neighboring practices. So not a randomized trial with a usual care arm, but still further evidence that academic detailing is good, particularly if you include the patient with a pre-visit handout. So in conclusion, academic detailing works, and particularly works well if you activate the patient prior to the visit. One thing, that's interesting is that most patients were not deprescribed in our study. And even though they were elderly, had good glycemic control, and were on hypoglycemic medicines. So sometimes that's completely appropriate, and sometimes you wonder maybe we need to be more active in that area. In terms of the pragmatic considerations of running the study, and to get the intervention to happen, this is sort of classic delivery science stakeholder engagement. We need to get on the physician's practice calendars early, and we had to make our intervention relevant. And they were very interested in this topic. I mentioned that we went with assent rather than consent with the PCPs, and at the cost of primary data collection from them. And it's actually not that easy to decide whether a medication is deprescribed. And so particularly for insulin, because a lot of the prescription is variable. So we have to use natural language processing to get to that. Okay, so that's a summary of study number one, the rationale behind it, the structure of it, some of the challenges we faced in implementing it, and then our results and potentially where we might want to go next. I'm going to pause here. Courtney, I don't know if there's any questions that I should address now or move on to the next study.
The only question in the chat so far was the link to the study, so I put it in there so that they could read it
Okay.
on their own. But we do have time now, it sounds like a couple minutes if there's a question specifically about this study for Dr. Grant. It's hard to find hard evidence on academic detailing, Richard. We talk about a lot in implementation science, but I'm actually so excited that I can cite your paper. an effect size for it. So this is great. I can't wait to
Excellent.
see the next study. Yeah.
All right. So, next study. This study is called SAGE, which stands for Safer Aging with Diabetes Monitoring. And this is a completely different strategy for older patients with type 2 diabetes, which is can we prevent hypoglycemia by empowering patients to know when they're going low, to understand why they're going low, and to prevent future hypoglycemia. So, in the prior slide, I mentioned that the majority of patients were not deprescribed. And the RCT design doesn't allow us to understand exactly why that is. But there are many patients with type 2 diabetes who are 75 and older who depend on insulin, like who can't stop their insulin. Um, so if you can't stop insulin, this strategy of monitoring might be one way to prevent hypoglycemia. I also wanted to point out that we spent a couple of months on this logo, and I'm totally stoked with how it turned out. It helps to have creative people on your team, and it just we stamped it on all of our materials. I put it on my slides. So if you're planning on doing a large pragmatic study, spend some time with the acronym and the logo. Okay, so that was kind of an irrelevant aside. So, safer aging with diabetes monitoring, or SAGE, our question was, can monitoring coupled with education reduce serious hypoglycemic events in older adults on insulin? It's a very similar eligibility criterion, except for um, the requirement was insulin. So patients just on sulfonylureas were not included, unlike the prior study. And I think one of the key concepts of this particular study and in general, when you're talking about changing care, the rule is information without action doesn't accomplish anything. And so just knowing whether you're low or not is not enough. We need to know what to do about it. So this was a pragmatic randomized clinical trial. This time we had a usual care cohort because it was usual care arm because it was funded by NIDDK. And our intervention was in-person hands-on training on how to apply and use a continuous glucose monitor, which is just a little coin-sized patch that continually measures glucose in the interstitium of your arm and uploads it to a monitor or to your smartphone and sets off an alarm when your sugars go too low. In addition to an in-person training, group-based training of how to put the thing on and how to upload the app and how to do a Teams meeting with us. We followed that and we gave them we called a hypoglycemic journal, which is basically a journal where they would write whenever they went low, whether they had symptoms or not, because many older patients have low glucose and don't have the symptoms of it, which is very dangerous, or if it happens overnight, and then to try to understand the context of it. And then they bring this journal and these events to these subsequent two group sessions that were online and were essentially hosted by a diabetes pharmacist who is an expert in preventing hypoglycemia. And so the monitoring became the teachable moment of how to prevent future hypoglycemic events. So our primary outcomes was hypoglycemia, which is an aggregate outcome of self-reported symptoms of severe episodes or of ED or hospitalization. And then we also looked at self-reported measures, patient-reported measures about confidence and stress, and we assessed their technologic proficiency. So some of the pragmatic issues of implementing this study is it's a real challenge to, and Courtney, you could probably speak to this, but it's a real challenge to engage older patients in modern technology. And so for us, it was the continuous glucose monitors. It was the app on their phone to see the results. And then because two-thirds of the three groups were virtual, they also had to be comfortable using Teams to attend these sessions. Also, initially this was a three-arm study. We had usual care, we had three group sessions, and we had three group sessions plus a one-on-one with a pharmacist. And the rationale for it was like the purple, the three group sessions with the plus an additional one-on-one with a pharmacist would be like the very best. And then the three group sessions alone would be sort of what was more practical. it turns out it's really, really hard to conduct a three-arm study that involves building patient cohorts and then setting dates for their three interventions. And we were really dragging because of the complexity of all of this. And so we reassessed the necessity of this, made the argument that actually, now that I think about it, it's not very practical, and most health systems won't be able to do a one-on-one with a pharmacist. And then I reached out to my program officer, and he agreed, and so we were able to simplify the design. It's also very hard to schedule all these sessions and to balance virtual and recorded options. And another issue, particular to this study, but generalizable to pragmatic studies, is that I didn't invent CGM. CGM's been around forever. People type 1 use CGM all the time. So there's some creeping contamination of adoption of CGM that we had to worry about. I think one of the key things, though, is that there was to get funded as an R1, you have to have innovation. And our innovation is the paradigm shift because CGM was traditionally used to control high blood sugars, to understand when you go high and to figure out how to lower it. And so we kind of flipped that paradigm on its head in the context of sort of geriatric care. It's really more important, and I showed you that the slide at the very beginning. It's really more important to avoid hypoglycemia at this stage of life. A lot of our treatment of hyperglycemia, high blood glucose, is to prevent long-term complications, but these complications can take 10 to 20 to 30 years to develop. And hypoglycemia is an immediate threat with implications for mortality, cognitive function, affect, and falls. And so often in medicine, we get locked into a certain paradigm, and good research is the research that can question that paradigm, potentially flip it. So our flip was to use CGM to prevent hypo rather than to reduce hyperglycemia. So the first session was in person. We had we had a little presentation explaining everything. And then we had the CGMs with us. We helped them put a little bit of alcohol underneath their arm. We showed them how to twist off the cap and we encouraged them to push the thing in. And then we had them open their phones and go to the apps and pull down the CGM app. So it's very hands-on, and this is essentially how we address the idea of technology in the elderly. Not an easy thing to do, and we felt it was really important to do that. In the real world, very often patients of any age are prescribed the continuous glucose monitor, like they get the piece of paper or they get the electronic order, and they pick it up and they look at the handout, but there's nobody there to really help them. And we thought it was particularly important for older patients to get this right. And it's not just the CGM itself, but like a lot of older folks and younger folks are a little bit oppressed by the idea of going to the app store and downloading stuff. So we really wanted that to work and to be hands-on. And then we also set them up for what the next two sessions were like. This is what the hypoglycemia journal looks like. We have some questions like what low readings surprised you? What changes did you make? What questions do you have? And then really this idea of that when an episode happens, like document the circumstances, and then these second and third sessions would occur 6 weeks after the first session, and then 4 weeks after that is really the kind of intellectual problem solving with the support of the pharmacist that patients need to be able to do on their own. To a large extent, severe hypoglycemia in the elderly can be avoided. And so we want to teach patients how to avoid that by leveraging their experience with the CGM and with their notebook. So these numbers are from this morning. We are 2/3 of the way there. A couple things to point out about the process of conducting and implementing the study is you'll recall the consent rate for retro was 36%. The consent rate for SAGE is about half that. It's not a surprise, even though it's the same patient population, there's much more asked of these patients. In the other study, you just need to get a handout in the email before a visit. No big deal. This one, we want you to be willing to put on a CGM. And so that, hence the lower consent rate. This study was not for people with cognitive impairment. That's going to require another R01 because it raises a whole different set of issues. And so about 13% of our patients failed a cognitive impairment screen. The penetration of CGM in this population was 17%, so manageable that we can still enroll enough patients. And then this is what you commonly do in studies is our outcome is hypoglycemia, so we want people to be at risk for hypoglycemia. And so part of our eligibility requirement is that you had hypoglycemia in the past 6 to 12 months. And so we lost some patients who were completely steady and probably would not have benefited from the CGM or continuous glucose monitor. Um, in As a researcher doing 5-year R01s to conduct clinical trials, like there's really nothing to report until the end, and so you need to keep busy. And so we published a paper on our intervention development to try to understand. So we interviewed older patients who had CGMs and older patients who did not have them, and tried to understand barriers to using these continuous glucose monitors. And people talked about the people who used them talked about challenges with wearability and reliability. Um, and then non-users thought that could understand the kind of questions they want to ask about it. So in terms of the pragmatic considerations, like I said, we did it in person at first. We simplified the study, and we had to exclude a fair number of people to avoid contamination by CGM. If anyone after consented and enrolled and randomized to the control arm got a CGM, we keep including them in our analysis because once they're randomized, they're always analyzed. But most of the patients in the control arm who would get a CGM from their doctor would not get all this training session stuff that we do. So I think that even so, it'll still be worth showing and be able to show a difference. Okay, that is the second study. It went a little bit faster than the first, and I've left plenty of time for conversation.
Oh my gosh, I love both these studies. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to raise their hand or ask a question before I get us started.
Can I say hi to Dr. Joshua Fenton?
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Fenton. We were roommates in medical school.
Hello,
No,
Richard.
you are not.
Yes, we
Yeah,
were.
Josh lives across the street from me.
Oh my God.
Richard was such a wonderful roommate. We
No,
really
I wasn't. You're lying. I never washed the dishes, you told me.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I had no idea. I worked with Richard a long time, Josh, on a couple trials
were
at
old
Kaiser.
friends. Yeah.
Aw.
Whole world.
Look at us making connections in the seminar. I love it. Um, but I do have a scientific question.
Yes.
I was curious about this digital training piece, Richard. You know me, I can't let it
Yes.
go. Are you doing a sub-analysis? And I wanted to hear about on the first study because it sounded like it was mostly tech-enabled for the physicians, but maybe not. Was there a digital part to the first study, or is it really a handout, snail mail handout, and they didn't have it, and patients didn't have any digital component to study number one? And my second question is, yeah, are you going to do a sub-analysis of your current RCT by that digital literacy score that you're measuring? Because I have questions about, yeah. Can you talk more about that piece?
Absolutely. So the first study, um, in terms of technology, the academic detailing, so all the regular practice meetings were online, and so it was no big deal, right? So docs are pretty good at Teams or Zoom or whatever. The Our initial concept pre-COVID, this study actually started before COVID. I had done a prior study. I don't know if you actually, Courtney, you were on that study where we did the iPad in the waiting room. So our thought was to give the handout to the patient in the waiting room, but that didn't fly during COVID, and so we pivoted to. So we when we consented patients over the phone, we made sure we got their email. We sent them the PDF of the handout. Then we called them to say, "Did you get it?" And then we talked them through how to open a PDF. And if they just never could really do it, we mailed it to them. So it's very handholdy, and it was very minimal tech. Opening a PDF was from your email. The second study, so yeah, I'm open to all kinds of subsequent analyses, and we are measuring technical skill, technology skill. But our hope is to have ameliorated that through this in-person training. So what question, Courtney, did you have about the second one?
Well, I just very rarely see people split out their data. by that variable, even though it comes up a lot. So I wanted to encourage that maybe you and I can talk about it because for
I want to
everyone that
write the paper.
I don't know about that, but I want to think about it. And maybe someone here on this call wants to write that paper because just to let you know, the reason why it's hard is you do these huge RCTs and then you publish your main outcome. And then sometimes you want to do a mediation analysis or some other way of it, and sometimes you don't have time, or there's all these reasons, but there's a lot of talk in the intervention world with all these new remote monitoring devices that digital skills are on the pathway to whether or not people will use them, but then you very rarely see something as good as yours that broke out self-report or and then the other question I had is like, did you track other barriers of people with the monitors over time? So you can so I hope other people have questions. I love the digital part. You guys know me. So I have a lot of questions, but I wanted to tell you, Richard, in my current remote blood pressure monitoring study, which you don't know about, we're doing English and Spanish, and we're doing the app. We're doing the same thing. We're training people and showing it. And a full 40% of patients in safety net settings say, I don't want the app at all. Can I
Yeah.
just take home the cuff and see my readings? Like, don't even show me how to use it.
Yeah.
I don't want it. And so we have good data on how many declined the app use and how many then also use the app. And it is much, much lower than how many did the readings at home or like looked at it. They still looked at it on the hard device, but I was thinking I wanted to publish that data because no one would believe me if I said that 40% of patients didn't want the app, but I have the real data to show that they just struggle with it and they want to check
No,
their blood
actually,
pressure at home, but that's not something they're interested in.
we have some in the intervention arm. We have something a little bit like that, in that we encourage people to do it on their smartphone, upload the app because there's some benefits to it. The main one being that we can look at their data, so our pharmacists can look at their data. But there's also an option of a reader, which is a separate device that doesn't really require anything. You just turn it on. And so we can tell how many people went with the reader versus the app. And then a very small number of people so far couldn't do either, but they were randomized into the intervention arm. So we basically encourage them to use the hypoglycemia journal, right? So it's a lot like blood pressure. They can see their sugars. It's just a matter of, and it will alarm. It's just a matter of what to do about it. So, and then in terms of the survey, so there's no CGMs in the control arm. So any sort of RCT framework we are asking that technology question at the beginning and at the end. And so we can look at a delta between arms and see if it hopefully it would improve, right, in the intervention arm.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, it's and they're so pragmatic. And you guys, please ask questions because I'm going to keep going. So please put a question in the chat or raise your hand. Um, but I wanted to say that the other thing I love about your studies, which we have been doing in our hypertension work, is trying to use existing times that providers are meeting. If you want providers or pharmacists to be an active part of your intervention, really thinking about how they practice and how to embed your work in there. And you talked about that's the standard systems engaged research, but maybe you could also give a few details about talking to the medical directors at these clinics and just really trying to get the engagement that you need. Kaiser is more uniform than maybe UC Davis Medical Center, but it still takes a ton of time to engage the practices
Yeah.
and some of that. And maybe you could give people some ideas about what that looks like.
Yeah. Some of my advice you'll like and some you won't. So I did another yeah, you were involved in coordinating another study, pre-visit activation for patients with diabetes, and we actually consented docs. And so I needed to get a whole bunch of practices to be part of it. This is kind of related to me being roommates with Josh, but they're like six of our classmates who are like practice leaders. And so like you remember Carolyn Marr, Josh? Like she runs San Rafael. I'm like, Carolyn, can I please come and talk? And then um the dude with the bow tie, I'm blanking on his name right now. What was his name? Really nice guy. He runs like
I'm
Petaluma or
blanking
something.
too.
Yeah. So, part of it is like that was early on when I first got here, is like you just need to leverage your connections. And obviously this is a little bit of a special case. But regardless, like I've been at DOR for 14 years and even non-classmates know me and have worked with me before. So the stakeholder engagement and relationship building is like a long-term commitment. And so that's part of the answer. But obviously, the other part of the answer is that some people who I never met before, who were like 15 years younger than me, who are like all these primary care doctors seem so young to me. They were super stoked about the idea of how do I address hypoglycemia and how do I prevent this from happening. So part of it is relationship building, but part of it is like if you have a really good idea that's compelling to them, they're more likely to be interested. Then obviously we made it as easy as possible by they didn't even know we were coming, but their practice leader knew. And one of my collaborators, co-investigators, Dr. Gilliam, is very well known because she's the diabetes lead. So it's not easy, but it also requires you to have something that people are interested in, right? Too much of research, not my research or your research, but like a lot of research feels like navel gazing. Like I'm so interested in like this thing, but other people are not as interested, particularly not practicing clinicians. And so there's kind of like this, does it matter to them or not? And I'm a primary care doctor by training, and I'm at a DOR with 60 different scientists, and everybody thinks that their thing is the most important thing in the world, but it's not. Especially as a primary care doctor, I'm like, okay, this is like one more thing you want me to add to like all the other things I'm supposed to do. But it turns out like diabetes and elderly, it's pretty common stuff, and it excited them. And so that was kind of those are the kind of elements that lead to successful implementation, I would say.
Such great pearl. Um, Yeah, I think just to add on to or to reiterate what you're saying, it's like you're starting from a place of what are the questions that matter and really listening to folks. And then the follow-up to that is to invest in relationships and to really adjust based on what people are saying. And so to me, I always say it's akin to community engaged research, right? You have to really put time in and you have to think about it for long term. It doesn't mean that the same people are there forever, but you have to put time and energy into thinking about the context of it. And you're so good at that. So I'm so glad you gave some pearls from that. Josh, I see you have a question.
Yeah, Richard. I was wondering, you were speaking about relevance to practice, and I just was wondering, like the academic detailing thing. I could definitely see how PCPs would be potentially interested in that. But from a pragmatic or feasibility aspect, this specialist physician that did the academic detailing, she had grant funding, I assume, to go and do this with you guys. And what is your team thinking about like how would you disseminate an academic detailing product that so that it's this efficacious product, which according to your observational data was the most potent intervention, right? It was more potent than the handout. So if you really wanted this to like have a big impact, how would you do that? I wondered about like AI and some way to duplicate this doctor, and maybe you guys have thought about that or discussed it.
Josh, that's actually a great question. It really is because, the career of a researcher, right? Like so much of it is like, okay, this is where it ends, and what happens next. Yes, Lisa was a co-investor. So I was also really lucky in that Lisa, she's an MD PhD with a research background, and so she's a common partner. I think she's 60% clinical, but she's very passionate about hypoglycemia, and so I was lucky to have a bit of a unicorn of like an active clinician who's also an active researcher, not able to write and lead an R1, but a great partner. Um, so in terms of spreading academic detailing, there are a couple of different options, right? We could have we did record her. You could just sort of send that out, but that's not going to have the same impact. So it has to come from a champion at the new place, right? So somebody has to really, let's say, you want to send it to a new system A, right? That's outside of Kaiser. The I'm not going to, I have no enticement other than saying, here's this thing. So someone has to really want it. Someone in leadership there has to identify it as a problem. And I'll say that just in the past couple of years, there's a new HEDIS measure about hypoglycemia. So that's a thing that, practice health system leaders love, right? How do we improve our HEDIS measures? And then there's clinicians who have their own experiences with a patient who gets hypo and breaks their hip. So if there's an enthusiastic recipient, then then it's a matter of like, is there someone there that people know that you'd want to do this? Here are our slides. Do you want to use our slides? Um, the handout, one of the less pragmatic aspects of the patient handout is that we timed it with the visit, and that required like a research infrastructure. But one thing that we are accomplishing because KP Northern California's pharmacy is interested in deprescribing in general is that we've had that handout uploaded to their suite of patient handouts that they can use. We're not going to study that because there's not really a framework for it, but it is something that's been adopted. But yeah, I think it gets back to this idea that you have to have something that people want and that and someone is willing on the other side to champion it. And then there's ways of doing that. And I'll be honest with you, Josh, I haven't really pursued that because I got like I'm a researcher, right? So as soon as like I'm done and get the paper, I'm writing my next grant. But if you're interested in this, I can send you the slides.
I'm not an expert though, and honestly, you could send me the slides, and I probably wouldn't be as effective as your diabetes office because I just don't know that I don't have the credibility. I don't have the that I'm not even sure there's somebody here at UC Davis that would be optimal, but perhaps UC Davis. But I think there are a lot of systems that it would be hard to find a champion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I am.
but it's no harsh criticism. I honestly think that this type of question is, it's just like you said, it's relevant to so many of the trials that get done, especially for behavioral intervention.
Yeah. I think deprescribing and just de-implementation in general is something that everyone does think is hard, really hard to do, Richard. And I think what I love about your studies too is that you're showing that it can be a priority for people. It can be simple to bring up. It doesn't have to be you have to deprescribe or you have to change what you're doing. It can be a more it's opening the door to meet provider and patient priorities and concerns, which is the other beautiful thing. And I think when I started my career 15 years ago, I feel like people told me that those aren't hard outcomes. You have hard outcomes in your study, but that those aren't hard outcomes, and then not to build your career around things. And I think you're showing how to do that while also having a really great outcome and measurement of hypoglycemia, but how to do it in a way that is really that's another reason why I think people are buying into your interventions. To go back to our point, is because you're making it fit into how real conversations actually happen. You're not saying everyone is going to do this intervention. It comes like this, and you have to do it this way. And if you don't do it this way, we don't want you in the study, which a lot of other researchers, I think, are getting wrong about how they're going about it. So I wanted to reemphasize that too. And then, if there's no final question, please you raise your hand because I'm going to ask one final question of you, but I'm going to watch the chat and the hands. Is that you're such a great implementation scientist, but you're publishing this in clinical journals. I was wondering if you could comment on who is your audience? Like, are you thinking of like an implementation science kind of framework for disseminating some of this, academic detailing work, or are you really thinking primarily of clinical audiences as the audience of your work? Because you have so much methods advancements you've done in these studies, but do you think of yourself like that? Um, and how you would
Yeah.
disseminate in the implementation science?
You're asking who am I? It's interesting, right? Because there's more cachet with JAMA Internal Medicine than some of the implementation journals, right? And I was an editor for it, so I really wanted to publish it there. I think that, there's still an actual evidence base that needs to be recognized, and like if we're going to change the ADA standards of care, like RCTs like this in JAMA Internal Medicine are still necessary. I could certainly, with a implementation partner, write more sort of methodologic papers. Um, it's, not to get completely off track, but the way that our research enterprise is structured is not conducive to improving care. And so I don't have the incentive to do these things because I need to write my next grants, right? And how terrible is that? There's a lot of knowledge that's being left on the table. So maybe presentations like this are a great way to find other people who'd want to collaborate and write some of these things.
Yeah, I would. We're growing our implementation science expertise here, but some of the people in this call are a part of that with me, and I might be interested in it. And some of our PhD students seem really interested in it, Richard, and they seem to be really engaged in it. And I think what's fascinating to me, which I think is true in all disciplines, is when you want to write it for an implementation audience, they want even more information about the academic detailing, and they'll think maybe your 30-minute or your hour-long talk wasn't enough. But you
Uh,
should, what I love about it is you showed it was practical and detailed and had an effect. And so like it's like you're caught between a rock and a hard place, right? Where you're trying to do implementation science research and you want to publish it in those journals. And then your clinical side, your clinical side when you show the impact. And I think a lot of where you sit and where I sit is kind of in between those worlds. And then sometimes it's like they're very different papers that you would write.
yeah.
And you have to
And
sort of sit there and think, which one of these am I going to write? I only have this much time to do
right.
it. Yeah.
And I was very careful about the whole consort academic implementation, I mean, RCT aspect. And there are a lot of frameworks to do with implementation science, and we didn't do that, right? We kind of kept it simple. So challenging for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to also make you come to implementation science meetings. Maybe I'm going to try to pull you in because I think we need to get out of, we need to both do it both ways and see the value of doing it both ways. Because, and I think that's for anyone in this room who's like a biostats expert or qualitative expert. I think whenever there's a content tension with a methods tension, we get a little stuck sometimes about what we're trying to do. And the beauty, I would say, of doing really impactful research, which your talks were a really great example, is you always want to be a little bit in between. You want to be thinking about excellence in both without being like beholden to the other. And so I see that all the time. It's like, oh, I have to do it this way. And it's like, yeah, but there's trade-offs. There's always trade-offs, and you want to be doing a good job with both, but you don't want to make one the master of the other or something like that. I don't know. That's a terrible way of
Yeah,
saying it, but I think you know what I
yeah,
mean.
yeah.
And that requires team science, and that requires working with other people, all the skills that I hope all of you are thinking about in your work, because and that's the fun part. That's how I met you. And that's how you get to do this. Like, don't it doesn't it, it's the real part of doing this work. So I love this talks. As you can tell, I'm very inspired. Now I'm like, I want to write more things with you. Do you have any final comments or remarks for our group in our last couple of minutes?
No, I mean, again, I want to thank you for inviting me to this. And if you have any of your PhD students that want to work together, then let me know.
I might. I
All right.
might. Please reach out to me, and I'm sure Richard would be happy to answer more questions from you. I just really appreciate you taking the hour to be with us today. I'm so glad you got to see your former roommate on this call. And I wish you all the best. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.